Ed Seljeskog, and this morning we're going to interview Dr. Charles Drake, Charlie as we like to call him, regarding his years in neurosurgery. And Charlie, I think to begin with, I think our audience would be particularly interested in your formative years and how you got involved with medicine and how you got involved with surgery and then neurosurgery.
Well, I grew up in the Depression in Windsor, Ontario, across the river from Detroit, where out of my class in high school, it's interesting that only 3 of us in 1938 went to university. It was that bad time economically. But the point of it is that there was a teacher. There were 2, but one particularly, a man named Fox, a biology teacher in the high school, that had a big influence on me. He made my enjoyment of biology so much more. And in the end, it was he that said to my aunts, because I was a ward of my aunts. My father died before I was born of the flu in 19. But he persuaded the family that he thought that I should go to university, and in particular medical school. I don't know how I became interested in medicine. I think it was just a part of biology at the time. But it was really that man Fox that persuaded the family to somehow get enough money to send me to, of course I worked. I used to shovel coal for 25 cents an hour in those days.
That's a memorable experience.
Yes.
Well, once you're in med school, what were your plans?
Well, I wanted to go to Ann Arbor to Michigan, because it was just across the river, and I thought I was a football player, and I remember there were 2 famous footballers there. They were sort of my heroes. At any rate, I started, I think as I recall, I actually enrolled or got close to it, and then I found out about the tuition, and that was not a possibility. So then I chose to go to the University of Western Ontario, in part because they had what was said to be a good medical school and also a good football team. But I was never a good player.
Well, what were your plans then? You were always going to be a surgeon, or I sort of that
No.
crystallized over the years as I sort of gather?
Well, in medical school, 1 or 2 teachers whom I admired, the surgeons, by this time, the war had begun, and many of our surgeons were off in units, because Canada went in 1939. So our surgical teaching left, I think, something to be desired, but medicine was really quite good, and I was fascinated with it. And then when it came time for internship, again, a couple of the medical teachers thought that I should have further training in internal medicine. And I was sent to the Toronto General Hospital for this purpose. But things happened there.
I noticed that you then went off to Yale for some physiology, so it's clearly that you were not focused on surgery at those early stages.
Well, that was another story, though, because during this internship at the Toronto General Hospital, we rotated through various services, and we were constrained because the war was on, and we were only allowed 9 months. As a matter of fact, our medical school was cut back from 6, was it, back to 4 years. But at any rate, I hadn't seen much surgery, and I finished the medical rotations, and then I saw these surgeons at work, and I became fascinated with that side of the story. And with two residents who'd come back from overseas to get a little more training. Bill Bigelow, who was the father of hypothermia for hearts, was the first surgical resident I knew. He's a magnificent man, has had an outstanding career, but he encouraged me. Gave me little things to do an appendix and this and that. But then my last rotation was on the neurosurgical service. And I saw this man, Kenneth McKenzie, at work, and I literally couldn't believe what I saw him doing. And we got along well together. His chief resident, Dave Bonin, developed what we called in those days an id reaction to the gloves and lost all the skin off his hands. So I was left alone on the service with Dr. McKenzie. And he was alone. It's a huge service, but Bottrell was away in the war overseas. And Keith and so on. And I worked like a dog. But I was very fond of that man, and we got along well together for reasons. In the end, when I was going off into the Army, we were on the elevator going up in the hospital the last day, and we were coming down the elevator. He said, "Drake," he said, "have you enjoyed the service?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Well, are you interested in being trained in neurosurgery?" And I said, "Yes, sir." Just like that. He said, "Well, come back and see me after the war." And that was it. But it was the man, McKenzie, that got me into neurosurgery.
No matching program or anything like that. No. Consummated in the elevator, wonderful. You then came back then to Toronto and your neurosurgical training. Clearly there were a number of figureheads there that passed through the department when you were there as well. But tell us a little bit about that years of training, which I'm sure was probably somewhat different than a residency today.
Yes. Well, Dr. McKenzie, whom, as you know, was Canada's first neurosurgeon, trained by Dr. Cushing, knew Dr. Penfield, who was in Montreal. And Dr. McKenzie was a general surgeon who had only a year with Dr. Cushing to become a neurosurgeon. But he thought that me, for some reason in particular, that I should have a fundamental training in science. And that's why I did 3 years in neurophysiology and anatomy. The last part of which was with John Fulton in New Haven.
Yes.
Which was a magnificent year. But this was Mackenzie's idea, to try and make a scientist out of me. I'm not sure that worked all that well. And then he brought me back to train in neurosurgery. It's interesting because I couldn't write my American boards, I don't think, because after I'd had a year and a half of training with McKenzie, 18 months, one day he said in the late fall, he said, "Drake," he said, "you've had enough." Charlie, he said, "You've had enough training. And I want you to go overseas now and see those, they were all friends of his, these great surgeons in Britain and Europe.
So you had gone to Stockholm and Amsterdam and Paris and London.
Yeah. That was a magnificent year, and I've encouraged residents since to do the same thing, to go off and see what's going on in the rest of the world with these magnificent surgeons. I had 2 breaks. One, I spent several months with Herbert Olivacrona in Stockholm at the Karolinska. Dr. McKenzie particularly wanted me to see him because he was saving the facial nerve in total removal of an acoustic neuroma. And Dr. McKenzie had never been able to do that. Of course, he was faced, as they all were, these huge tumors of the day. And he was doing aneurysms because I had become interested in the aneurysm story. And it was there, incidentally, that I met Justin Orlean, who was another magnificent surgeon. We became good and old friends. The other break I had, that's where I learned to use ligatures on aneurysms. Both he and Oliver Krona used to tie off the neck with a piece of linen thread. I'm not sure it shouldn't be looked at again today, because none of those aneurysms recurred. The other break I had was I went up to Oxford to spend just a few days with Sir Hugh Cairns. And then I went back to London and back to the, I think it was Queen Square then. And a month or so later, I got a call from his secretary. Asked me if I would speak with Sir Hugh, and of course, he said that he'd had an American resident there who, for reasons unknown to me, up and left. And he needed a little help. So he asked me if I'd come up and stand in for this young man. Of course, I jumped at it. And so I had another time, more prolonged, at the Radcliffe with he and Joe Pennybacker. And that was another marvelous time. Cairns was not a slick or flashy surgeon, but he was thoughtful. He was brooding about the problems, and he was a great man. He had an untimely end. Only 56. Got a sarcoma of the cecum.
So very clearly then, this tour that you had, fellowship if you want to call it such, was really a time where a lot of your neurosurgical interests sort of crystallized, what have you. You know, everyone thinks about the Oliva-Krona dissector. It's really a ligature carrier, then it sort of fits very well with what you observed. Well, then you returned back to University of Western Ontario about that time, isn't that?
Yes, I was supposed to stay in Toronto with Dr. Mackenzie. We actually had an agreement, and with Bottrell. But I'm not sure of the whole story, but the powers that be, or were at the University of Western Ontario at that time, wanted to begin a neurosurgical service, particularly through a man named Angus McLaughlin, who was the professor of surgery, another remarkable Canadian surgeon. And I was a Western Ontario boy, Southwestern Ontario boy, and Galley, who was the professor of surgery then in Toronto, talked to Dr. Mackenzie, I guess, and to Bottrell. At any rate, I was persuaded to go to Western because it's Mackenzie knew about it. It's the most densely populated part of Canada, so there was lots of patient material. And the other thing he told me, Harry Bottrell was a very dominant figure, as you may know. Great man. And Ken Mackenzie told me he thought that, and to quote him, that I might blossom there at Western Ontario on my own better than I might under Harry Bottrell. Harry knows about this, so I'm not
words of wisdom. Well, getting back to Mackenzie just a little bit, you know, he had spent some time with Cushing. Did he recount to you any little anecdotes that you might recall about his experiences with Cushing? We're always interested in that sort of
I
thing.
don't remember many, but he recounted several, but one I remember of a very aristocratic lady from New York who came up to have a small lesion taken off her forehead, I think it was, come up to Boston. And what was Cushing's orderly's name? At any rate, the poor woman, after being anesthetized, they pulled her hair up and cut all her hair off for this lesion on her scalp. The lady Dr. Cushing was very upset about that, apparently. I don't know, today I suppose they'd sue him, but in those days they're just bad words. The other was, he told me how Dr. Cushing was at his best with a meningioma. But he recounted something that I've taught residents and students ever since, what I call that last little bit. And he said that one day Dr. Cushing was removing an intersphenoid ridge meningioma, and he'd done a beautiful job, and there were just a little bit left stuck down at the clinoid down near at the carotid. And he took the pituitary rongeurs and just tried to tease that little bit off. And Dr. McKenzie said the carotid came away. And he said that Dr. Cushing turned to him and said, McKenzie, you close the head with this eruption of arterial bleeding. And so he did. He said there was no attempt to put a clamp on it was done. So that's what I call the last little bit. Because I've done the same thing, getting the last little bit of clot out of
I think we've all done that.
Neck of an aneurysm or so on.
Well, who are some of the other notable figures in Toronto? Clearly, it's a name of center of neurosurgical excellence, and it remains such today in Toronto. Lougheed was...
Bill Lougheed, he was a resident about 2 or 3 years after me. He was in the Bottrell time. Bottrell, Dr. McKenzie retired in 1960, and Bottrell became chief of the division of neurosurgery. It was a division, no department. Harry was also started out to be an internist and was persuaded to go into neurosurgery. I think Dr. McKenzie said I was always the last McKenzie resident. He didn't train very many people. It was very interesting because he felt that the way Sachs and others did, that the need for neurosurgeons was not large, that general surgeons should be taught to look after head injuries and do burr holes. And at any rate, Bottrell assumed the chairmanship, and Lougheed was one of his first residents. By that time, the aneurysm affair was in full bloom. And Lougheed went to Boston to work with Bill Sweet on hypothermia there, and that's what he brought back to Toronto, although Bill Bigelow had been doing it for the hearts. The aneurysm story is an interesting one. How I got interested. We used to consult when you were the chief resident on the medical wards all the time, because we had the old medical ward system. And we'd been, in those days, nothing was done much for aneurysms except carotid ligation on a few. There had been some aneurysms clipped, as you know, and particularly in Scotland. And I remember I saw 3 women that I'd been called to see die on the medical ward in Old Ward H, almost in front of my eyes, 2 of them. One of them was on the bedpan behind the curtain when she blew it. And that got me very interested, and somehow Harry Bottrell got interested in clipping an aneurysm. I've just forgotten the circumstances. But at any rate, a man came in with a middle cerebral aneurysm. And Harry said, we'll clip this aneurysm on Monday. Well, Harry had to go away that weekend, perhaps to a meeting somewhere, I've forgotten. And my goodness, if the man didn't have another bleed on Saturday morning with a clot in his temporal lobe. And so I called Dr. McKenzie, and he said, well, Charlie, take the clot out. So we opened the man's head and took the clot out, and you know, you're young and curious, and I was fussing around with a sucker and a little dissector, and this aneurysm popped into view. And I didn't know quite what to do with it because I didn't know anything about clipping those days. And I called Dr. McKenzie again, and he said, "Charlie, put a clip on it." So all we had were the little McKenzie silver
Sure.
clips. So we put a clip on it, and that finished the aneurysm. I actually cut it off, most of it off, and sent it to the lab. But it was the first aneurysm clipped in Toronto, perhaps in Canada, for all I know. But I did it as a resident, and that fired me up because the man survived it, and I realized that something could be done. But then Harry became Harry was upset in the first place because
Naturally.
because but he was good about that, and we saw more and more cases on the wards, on the medical wards, and we had that early flurry of operating on aneurysm. We had a lot of disasters. I remember Dr. McKenzie taking a silk ligature. We used to pin an artery, put it through, and then tie it one side and then the other, doing that to an aneurysm. And I've seen him char an aneurysm, take we only had the Bovie in those days. Those were great experiences.
Formative years of aneurysm surgery.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit about developing the department in London, and how you went about that, sort of starting from scratch, so to speak.
Well, when I went to Western, this man Angus McLaughlin, the chairman of surgery there, was a visionary and extremely helpful. Almost anything I wanted, he would try to get for me. He was one of the first full-time professors of surgery in Canada, and he used to use his extra income to support young people and their projects. In the beginning, I was just given an operating room. I wasn't given one. The orthopedic surgeons had an operating room. This is a big hospital, a 1,000-bed hospital. But I had to operate in the afternoon after the orthopedic surgeons had finished. And I often operated well on into the night. But it was a division of the Department of Surgery. But he was a benevolent dictator, and that works well. I'd met Henry Barnett as a young houseman in Toronto at General Hospital. He was a neurologist, of course, now so well known. And we became fast friends, and we went to Queen Square together. In fact, they had a house in Caterham in south of London. And they invited Ruth and I to stay with them during those months in England. So we became very fast friends. And we argued about neurology and neurosurgery and the future, what was to be in the future, our future. And that continued after we went back, he to Toronto and I went to Western. And we developed the idea of what we had seen in Britain of getting neurosurgery and neurology together because they have so many things in common. And this idea went along, and then another matter occurred. They were building a new university hospital in London, Ontario. And I had been offered just a tiny bit of it because I wanted to centralize neurosurgery. And there's a story that you may not want to put in this, but it had a big influence on me. You may want to edit this out. But Dr. Galley told me a number of things. He was the professor of surgery in Toronto when I was leaving. For example, he told me, never take on any young man on your division, as you know, on the staff, unless you believe in your heart that he's better than you are. And I've tried to adhere to that. To do otherwise breeds only mediocrity. These people that feel threatened, it's wrong. But he told me the story of Edsel Ford, because a certain surgeon in Toronto was a very good gut surgeon. And Edsel became ill, and so he went to, they sent for this surgeon to go to Detroit, to the Henry Ford Hospital, to operate on Mr. Ford. And he made several mistakes, but at any rate, he opened Mr. Ford, and he was full of carcinoma and simply closed it. But he sent the Ford family a large account for those days. And the Fords, you know, they're very bright people. They resented it. Anyway, they paid the bill, of course. But Dr. Galley said that he thought that as a consequence of that, that Toronto never got a cent out of the Ford Foundation, which is the richest of the foundations in your country. And he told me to remember that. And so it happened to me. Well, Dick Ivey, everybody knows that at home, a very wealthy young man. His wife got ill in England, and he flew her home with a simple, ruptured, sequestrated lumbosacral disc. But the orthopods in England hadn't wanted to do anything about it. But at any rate, we took it out, and Beryl had a very good result. And I didn't know Dick before, but he kept asking me, I haven't had an account from you. And I said, you know, it was a great pleasure for me to help with Beryl, and I was glad to do it. This went on, and finally Dick one day said, well, what on earth can I do for you? And at that time I was interested in HPO, the high oxygen pressure in tanks. And so we got a little group together, went over to Glasgow and to Holland. Dick sent us over. I took an engineer and a biophysicist and so on. It was a great trip.
Hans Burima Institute.
That's right. And the one in Glasgow, and that went on for a while. And then he had me over for supper, he and Beryl, for just to talk. And one night, I was telling him about the University Hospital, that I wasn't getting much space. He said, well, what do you want? I said, I want a whole floor. And he said, how much would it cost? And I said, I don't. He said, find out. And we went to see his father, and as a consequence, he gave me, I think, $3 million in those days to build another floor on the hospital. Now with that, I went to Barnett, to Henry, and said, here, we've got this facility, and perhaps we should think about getting together. So we ended up going to the Senate, getting a Department of Neurosciences through the Senate, the rest of the university, and that's how that began.
Another unique thing that I've noticed in London at the university is that you have a limited tenure. Is that a good idea, particularly to direct the clinical neurosciences, as I recall?
Yes, we wanted it to be a rotating chairmanship. It was a 5-year affair. Barney was so good, we kept him on an extra 5 years. But no, we wanted the authority to change, and that's worked out pretty well. Many say that it's worked out well because we were such old friends, and that it might not work so well in the future. But to date, I can tell you that even with the recent review from the college, that to a man and woman in the department, they're all for the maintenance of this system.
Tell us a little more about some of your colleagues in the department over those many years that you've been professor, and number two, some of your trainees. over the years. Only the good ones.
Well, when I first, I worked for, I think it was 16 years alone in that huge hospital. I was never home. Ruth said the children grew up without me. Because none of the young surgeons that went through it, they used to rotate general surgeons through the neurosurgical service. None of them seemed to have any particular interest in neurosurgery. Several made tentative arrangements, but then backed out. And the first one that I got was Hugh Barr, a very bright student. And of course, his father is the discoverer of the Barr body, the sex chromatin. And I thought, that would be a good rub-off for a... And Hugh was the first. He trained a little bit with me, and mostly in Toronto, and then I picked up John Gervin, who's a physiologist. He's a surgical physiologist. Trained partially by Dr. Penfield, and the rest with me. And then we gradually built up the service. Young Ferguson, who was a PhD biophysicist, did all that beautiful work on the growth of aneurysms. And then we got persuaded Skip Peerless to leave Vancouver.
Come east.
And come east. He's one of the, I think, one of the great surgeons of this day. It was a disappointment that he left. One of the most important things about the service after its creation is succession. And it's so important to try and keep that continuum of new minds and people that will keep everything going on an upgrade.
One of the famous quotes from Owen Wagenstein was that your greatest power as a chairman are your powers of appointment and succession. Well, you've been involved with a number of organizations. You and I have been tied up with the College of Surgeons for a number of decades. How do you see the College of Surgeons fitting into all of this? Clearly you've been involved with the Senior Society of Neurosurgery, the AANS, been president of both organizations. Reflecting back, how does it seem to you that the college fits into this, and should neurosurgeons be all involved with the College of Surgeons? Your active interest and participation has been certainly noteworthy over the years.
Well, I came to have the greatest respect for the American College of Surgeons after coming on the Board of Regents, as you have, to be close to and with these remarkable men that make up that Board of Regents, who stand up for the proper things, and no matter what the cost. I came to know more about the other specialties of surgery, and I thought that there should be a coming together of at least of their administrative units, even within the college. But that didn't work out. They've tended to separate. There are a few in Chicago. Most were going to Washington at that time because of the socioeconomic.
Still are.
And still are. And that didn't work out. The growth of the specialty societies, too, has been such that to get the annual meetings anywhere into the college congress, for example, is just not possible. The college has kept up through its advisory council, small affairs, but not with large attendance, I believe.
Correct.
I think now the college is the spokesman for surgery in general. Certainly at the Washington level and at the ethics level and so on.
Well, that certainly seems to be the direction that it continues to move, and I think very appropriately so. When you were president of the AANS, what's your most memorable experience from that block of time, or from the time when you were on the board of directors? Things were different then.
Yes, it was more like a club in those days. I suppose I was there at a time when people were becoming more and more concerned with the economics and the practice of neurosurgery. And that was the beginnings of the Congress. I think the AANS board tended at that time to ignore those features. But in the end, I was, as you know, I wrote that I wondered about the need for two such organizations. The Congress stating that they wanted to put their effort into the young surgeons of the country. But these two huge meetings, I actually thought there might be some kind of amalgam, that it could be combined. But I think I may have been wrong, because it's worked out well.
Well, that argument, that debate still is ongoing,
Oh, is it?
and particularly now that socioeconomic pressures are influencing everyone in all organizations, there's probably a more vocal interest in that sort of thing, some type of amalgamation of the two bodies than ever has occurred, at least in my view. Over the years, you've traveled a lot. Clearly your fellowship after training, but as I recall, you had a major traveling fellowship awarded by the Royal College of Surgeons of England, the Sims Fellowship. I was really most envious when you were awarded that, because that's a block of time where you can travel the world. Tell us a little bit about that and the merit of it.
Well,
It's a marathon, I'm sure.
an old professorship from a Rhodesian man who wanted the English College to have their surgeons come out and help their surgeons in the developing world. He wanted it to be in the English-speaking world, and I suppose in the so-called colonies of those days. But at any rate, the English College every once in a while chooses a man to go on this. They hadn't chosen many neurosurgeons. And they wanted me to go to Australia, New Zealand, and Malaysia. And it was a very interesting time. Visited all the major units. There was an open welcome in every unit. Ruth went along. That was part of the deal, that your wife accompanied you. We had a marvelous time. It was, as you say, a marathon, because you were literally on the stage. I think in the 4 months we were away, Ruth and I calculated we had only 4 evenings to ourselves. And then there were all the lectures, and I didn't do any operating. I think some of the Sims did, but I felt that really wasn't a part of it. I did do a few, well, we went to India. We visited 5 units, I think, in India. Remarkable place. Have you seen it? You must see it. It's 800 million people, in a land not much larger than Ontario. I've forgotten what I was talking about.
Visiting the units in India and operating.
Well, The operating, yes. I didn't operate. I did in India, or I helped them out with a few aneurysms in Australia, and I did do a few aneurysms and AVMs in India because there's just no hope of them getting out.
Coming back to aneurysms, you know, you've had a wealth of experience going back, you know, decades. What are kind of some of the most notable things? You know, we talked about hypothermia. Your first aneurysm was clipped with a tiny Mackenzie clip. I mean, we wouldn't think of that sort of thing today. Spinal drainage. Well, what are some of the landmarks that you view as being important in aneurysm surgery?
Oh, dear, well, the technique for occluding the neck, we had, for a neck of any size that wouldn't hold a Mackenzie silver clip, or a liver corona came out at about that time with the little wing clip, but it wasn't much longer. We used a ligature. And the ligature, because I'd learned with the liver corona and Norlane, I used it a lot in the early days, and so I didn't pursue a longer clip, although we used to take a piece of tantalum, you know, and cut a clip out of it.
Mold your own.
Yeah, and the length you wanted, and then put it on with a mosquito forceps. Put it over the neck and crush the neck of the aneurysm. My goodness, what we did in those days. I think the big thing was the development of the spring clip, which was largely Frank Mayfield. There had been, I believe, earlier spring clips. Henry Schwartz used a woman's hair curler, didn't he, as a hair clip. And then the effort to reduce the hazard of inadvertent rupture of the aneurysm. I remember the first aneurysm I did when I got back to Western, a man named Stevens. Simple carotid aneurysm. Well, no one in that university had ever seen an aneurysm, so the operating room was jammed.
Packed.
And I stepped aside and had this resident hold the sucker just to keep the spinal fluid out of the field so everyone could come in and peek and look at an aneurysm. And I've often said that there's no man so lonely as a surgeon in deep trouble in the operating room. Well, you know what happened. He put the sucker tip through the aneurysm. And took a few minutes to control it. I ended up having to clip the carotid because it tore a great hole in the carotid artery. And when I looked up and around, there was no one in the operating room. I was alone. That was we all fear that rupture, although it's a little different today, but we went to hypotension. Well, for years I used the thumb on the carotid artery in the neck. Sir Jeffrey Jefferson told me that. And that was good. Why I should have had a thumb on that day.
I think we've all thought of that and tried that trick.
And then we were into artificial hypotension. You remember in Cleveland how Gardner used to remove a lot of blood from them to knock their pressure down. And then the chemicals came. And then to try and brain protection, we went through the hypothermia affair to moderate hypothermia, which was introduced, I guess, by Bill Sweet and then by Bottrell and Lougheed. And then when the pump, the bypass pump came along, we tried that. We had a lot of tragedies. And then we sort of abandoned hypothermia. We tried hypothermia, one of the reasons at least, was for early surgery, to see if we couldn't operate on a patient under hypothermia and not get into this devilish tragedy of vasospasm. But that didn't work. And we abandoned hypotension, hypothermia. It took so long, and I'm not sure that it improved things very much, and went back to what I used to call profound hypotension, and run these patients with systolics of 40. they seem to take it. I'm sorry, means of as low as 40. And I think that did help us. And perhaps that's why we abandoned hypothermia when we learned we could take a patient down to those levels and have a much slacker aneurysm. They still broke, of course. Now there's a swing back, I guess, for the giants, isn't there, to trying the profound hypothermia.
Where do you think endovascular therapy is going to go? You know, there's a little surge of interest every so often, first with hog hairs and then with iron filings and now with a very sophisticated catheter and coils. What's your prediction?
Well, you're always wrong when you predict, of course, but we've been into the endovascular story in our unit, as you know, since the beginning. And I've watched it and supported it because I felt we can't ignore it. We must see what's in it. And of course, we got persuaded de Bruyne to come over from Paris, and that was a big impetus in our unit. And I watched the balloons because he was expert with them. But I watched the tragedies as well, and I still think that the balloons are a form of Russian roulette, because you literally don't know what's going to happen. The detachments, the bursting of the balloon and the glue escaping, and the emboli and rupture of aneurysms and arteries. But balloons have gone their way, and I think they're out of the aneurysm story, with the single exception of they're used to occlude major arteries, the Hunterian principle of proximal occlusion. And that's working out well for the large extracranial arteries. And I think that's going to be their major use. The wire, I first wired an aneurysm. I persuaded Sean Mullen to come up and do a big basilar bifurcation aneurysm. We filled it with wire, and the postoperative angiogram, there was no filling, and even with the experts reading the film. In fact, I'm putting that in the book. And the woman died a year later with a rapid decline, but with clear spinal fluid. But Sean got an angiogram on her in Chicago, and before she died, and the whole base of the aneurysm had blown out. The wire hadn't compacted. There was 16 or 18 feet of wire in it. The base of the aneurysm had merely expanded and pushed this big aneurysm up into the hypothalamus. And that's lived with me. And now I'm seeing it again with the coils. I think the coils are going to ultimately be best for, and perhaps restricted to, the aneurysm with the small neck. Because the aneurysm with the big neck, they simply can't deal with it safely yet. And it's not panning out for the giant aneurysms because of the radial disbursement and paction of the wire coils and regrowth of the aneurysm. I had thought that there would be a place for coils in the acute treatment of an aneurysm. Say the morning of a subarachnoid hemorrhage, go and coil the dome of the aneurysm, and then let the patient ride out the storm of brain injury and vasospasm and so on, and then go in and operate on the aneurysm at your leisure a month later. That might be an ideal circumstance. It won't work, of course, if the fibrinolysis really do prevent vasospasm, because I don't think you'd dare put a fibrinolysin in the spinal fluid with a dome-coiled aneurysm. We've used the principle once or twice, well, more than once or twice, not without success either. And I remember operating on 2 aneurysms that have been coiled. They've been coiled a little too much because some of the wire had got down towards the neck, and every time I put a clip on the neck of the aneurysm, the wire coil would hold the clip open. So we ended up having to open the Anderson and remove the coils first. Now, the new features are, whether they'll work or not, I don't know, are stents. Perhaps biological stents. I can only see them working on very straight arteries, like the carotid.
Sure.
And then you've got to leave space in them somehow for the perforators and the major branches around the neck of an aneurysm. I think many are trying perforated wire stents. But there are attempts to develop stents for Y bifurcations and so on. Then there's a little resurgence of the glue, of filling an aneurysm with glue and filling it under the screen so that the glue just comes to fill the neck, with those dangers.
Certainly with stents, their application seems presently to be in the field of general surgery and some distance to go. Now, you mentioned a book. Tell us about that.
I haven't believed in writing books.
But you've got to write a book.
But,
we want you to write a book.
Well, because I wrote a lot of chapters for multi-authored texts, as you know.
Dozens.
And when the galley proofs arrived, I realized they were out of date. And of course, you can't change things very much then. And they're even more out of date when the book's published a year later. So I didn't want to do that. However, this collection of vertebral basilar aneurysms is so large, nearly 1,800 cases, so unique, and I've been persuaded that they should be, something should be written about them,
Rightfully so.
if nothing else for the historical interest. But it's quite a burden writing a book. But I can see the end now. We're nearing it.
Oh, wonderful. Well, besides the book, what are you going to do? Where's your future going? Are you going to just fly and play golf? What's up?
Well, right now, the book. It's an all-absorbing affair. I spend the mornings on the book, and the afternoons, and the good weather, on the golf course. A game of golf, I don't know what I'd do without it. I think I'm fascinated with it because it's the most difficult of all games. I only wish I'd started when I was young. But I have other interests. I've been flying for years. It was a practical matter getting out of London, Ontario, because I had to go to Toronto or Chicago or Detroit or Cleveland to go anywhere. I can beat the airlines really as far as the mountains. You can't beat the jets across the continent, of course. And Dr. McKenzie introduced me to fly fishing and to shooting, upland shooting and some duck shooting. And I've still have a modest interest in the wildlife, the birds and the flowers, the Canadian wildflowers, for example. And I seem to keep busy most of the time.
I have no doubt about that. Charles, thank you for your time. We all appreciate it.